Okay, so we've talked about the geological time scale and how it's broken down. And basically, the last thing that we're going to talk about is why fossils are so important in understanding geological history and evolution. Because fossils is our only way to basically tell how living things have changed over time. So this is our learning target 21. After this, you should be able to explain how the fossil records are used to study the geological and biological history of our Earth. Back to the notes, I forgot to have the link on there. Okay, so let's review what a fossil is. A fossil is the remains or traces of prehistoric organisms. They help scientists determine when life appeared, when animals became extinct, and how or where they lived. Now, not everything becomes a fossil. This is pretty key to understand. So our geological timescale has gaps, meaning we only know about the living things that lived here on Earth that became fossils. If living things did not become fossils, we have no idea that they were around. That's the only way that we know they were in our past. So in order to become a fossil, the decomposing organism has to be buried quickly. If it's buried quickly under layers of rock and dirt, then it's going to be protected from the elements like weathering and erosion. The other thing that the living things need, or the fossils need to have, are hard parts, because soft parts don't fossilize very well. So if you think about it, your skin and anything that's made out of cells and tissues do not fossilize very easily. But bones, those hard parts, the shells, those will become fossilized a lot easier. The other thing that has to occur is the fossils have to be protected from scavengers. So, for example, when something dies, if it's fed off of, then it's probably not going to become a fossil. And it's got to be protected from agents of physical and chemical destruction, from water and air. So that's where your weathering and erosion comes into play. Okay, so this animation shows a dinosaur getting buried by sediment. After it dies, it becomes a fossil and then becomes exposed. So this is showing you how the fossil gets found. It's going to show it to you again. I'll let you watch it one more time. Fossil, dinosaur dies, gets buried quickly. Notice the hard parts are what remain. All the soft parts are not going to become fossilized. Gets buried under sediments, layers upon layers of sediments. And then it gets, the rock layer gets what we call tilted, and then it gets exposed. Okay. Now, there are different ways that fossils can be preserved, and we're going to go over all the different ways that living things can become fossils. So the first type is what we call pre-mineralized remains. This means that spaces inside are filled with minerals from groundwater, and some of the original material might remain. So if you look at this, is a picture of a tree. Inside these cracks are filled with groundwater, which then hardens and forms minerals, and then that can create a fossil. So that's one type of preservation. Another type is carbon films. This is where actually soft parts can become fossilized. This is showing you tissues of organisms that contain carbon, not carbons, contain carbon. The element carbon, a residue is left forming a silhouette of an original organism. And I spelled that wrong. I apologize. I must have been typing really fast. Okay, so this is kind of like if you ever take paper that's really thin and you take like some charcoal like that you use in art, and you can put it on like a gravestone and you can etch it on that paper. That's kind of what a carbon film is. Okay, so sometimes that happens and you can leave. This isn't actually the remains. It's kind of like an imprint of an outline of the fish on the rock. So that's what a carbon film looks like. Now molds and casts. Okay, a mold means that the hard part decays, leaving behind a cavity or a hole in the rock. So this is a mold right here. So this shell, the hard part of the shell decayed, went away, but it left behind indentions in that rock. Then later on, a cast is formed. That's where minerals enter the cavity, and they harden, and they form a copy of the original object. So this isn't the actual shell; it's just a copy. So you've seen that when maybe your parents have done that when you guys were babies. They did your fingerprints or handprints. They made a mold of that. Okay, this is going to show you an animation on how a shell can form a mold and a cast. So over time, okay, that hard part was eroded away, left behind an indentation, and then over time, minerals filled up that hole and made the cast. So I'll play it one more time. Gets buried quickly, notice, it's got to be buried quickly, it's got to have hard parts, leaves behind an imprint, that mold, then minerals come in, fill it in, and makes a cast. Okay, original remains is actually the whole organism is preserved, soft and hard parts. This can happen when tree sap hardens. That tree sap hardens and makes amber. It can trap an insect inside the sap, and then it will harden, and then that amber will actually have the preserved specimen in there, like the movie Jurassic Park. But no, that cannot happen. We cannot take DNA from the blood of a mosquito that beat a dinosaur and make dinosaurs, just so you know. It does not work that way. Okay, tar pits will do the same thing. Tar pits can preserve soft and hard parts of living things. So tar pits are found in really swampy areas. So dinosaurs could have been preserved in tar pits. Okay, trace fossils. So like handprints and plaster. So when your parents made handprints or baby footprints when you guys were younger, those are called trace fossils. Animal tracks, so when animals leave tracks, like if you guys have ever gone to Dinosaur Ridge down by Morrison, you will see a ton of animal tracks from dinosaurs that were left on the rocks. Worm tails and burrows, those are all what we call trace fossils, because it just shows an idea of how big their prints were and where they roamed. So that's what a trace fossil is. Index fossil I mentioned with the trilobites. These are remains of species that existed on Earth for short periods of time. There were a lot of them, and they were widespread geographically, so they were all over Earth. So remember, in the Paleozoic era where the trilobites were, it was mostly ocean during that time frame. So the trilobites lived in oceans. They were all over the oceans. So we find fossils of trilobites all over. So geologists can estimate the age of rocks using these fossils. So if trilobites only existed during the Paleozoic era, and we find a rock that has a trilobite, then we know how old that rock is. It was created or formed in the Paleozoic era. So index fossils are pretty important to use. And remember, they're only around for a certain amount of time. Okay, so our fossil record is used by geologists to study geological events, and they also biologists use it to see how living things have changed over time in the past and in the present. Now, there is the law of superposition, which we will spend a lot of time on in another unit. But just so you guys have an idea of it, in order for a fossil to become fossilized, it has to be buried quickly. So in undisturbed layers of rocks, the oldest rock is on the bottom. So if we find a fossil that has been laid down in horizontal layers, if we find a fossil in this layer, we know it's older than a fossil found in this layer based on the law of superposition. So the law of superposition basically states the bottom layer, if it has not been disturbed, and we're going to talk about that when we do relative dating later on. Sometimes these rock layers can get disturbed. But if they haven't been disturbed, then the oldest layer is the layer on the bottom, and so the fossils found at the bottom are going to be older than the ones found above it. Okay. The way we look at fossils, we can look at the relative age and absolute age. Relative age is age in comparison to other things. So, for example, If I find a fossil of a trilobite in this layer, in layer 2, then that means the rock in layer 2 was formed during the Paleozoic era, because that's where the trilobites were around. That's relative age. Absolute age is the age in years based on rocks. So there's something called carbon dating, where we can actually look at carbon and rock, and we can actually find the actual date in years on how old that rock is. That's how we found out how old the Earth is, by looking at rocks and using carbon dating and dating them back. Okay, so using fossils to interpret the past, what does the fossil record reveal about plants, animals, and the environment? So the top of the mountain is full of marine fossils. What came before these mountains? Well, obviously what came before is there was a lot of marine life. Mountains were either underwater. What fossils do we find before prehistoric animals? Okay, we're going to find the dinosaurs. What do we find before these dinosaurs? Amphibians, because amphibians were around before the dinosaurs. For the amphibians, we have the prehistoric marine life. Okay, law of superposition. If you want to look at this, you can practice this. It's dropping the numbers on the layers in order from oldest to youngest, so you can look at the layers. Okay, here are your numbers. You can. I don't think you'll be able to move them like me, but if this is our oldest, number 1 is our oldest. Remember, bottom layer, it should go there. 2. Okay, you can practice putting them in order. Law of superposition. And notice they've got fossils in the layers. Okay, so these fossils are older than the fossils in this layer, and so forth. All right, so that concludes Learning Target 23, explaining how fossils are used to study the geological and biological history of Earth.